Welcome to There's Sometimes a Buggy, Irresponsible Opinions about Classic Film. I'm Elise.
I'm Dave. This week it's MGM 1930, the Hollywood Studios Year by Year Round 2. We'll be discussing The Florodora Girl and Madam Satan. Before we do any of that though, let us hear from Joel W. Findler with his great chart of personalities under contract to the studio in a given year. He will give each person a 1, 2, or 3 star rating depending on his impression of their value to the studio throughout the length of their contract. We start with Wallace Beery, 2 stars. Clark Gable, 3 stars. Buster Keaton, down to 1 star. Ramon Novarro, 2 stars. Marion Davies, 1 star. That doesn't seem right. John Gilbert, 2 stars. Norma Shearer, 3 stars. Joan Crawford, 3 stars. Greta Garbo, 3 stars. Marie Dressler, 2 stars. And Robert Montgomery, 2 stars.
Marion Davies was such a disaster that she rates the same as a B-movie actor.
Well, she had sort of her own studio within the studio, right? The Cosmopolitan unit. I do not presume to know the mind of Findler, but maybe that was part of his idea here, that she didn't really interface with a lot of the rest of the studio, and she moved lock, stock, and barrel over to Warner Brothers at a certain point. But it still seems wrong. Another feature of the Findler book that we're delving into on round 2 of the Hollywood Studios Year by Year, we're just going to take note of any Oscars awarded to the studio in that year. For MGM, in the Oscar year 1929-1930, they won 2 Oscars. The Big House won for sound, and The Divorcee won for Best Actress, Norma Shearer. Another book I introduced when we did our second round of Paramount 1930 was John Springer's Forgotten Films to Remember. I'm not going to reread his entire introduction to the year 1930, although I do urge you to check out that episode to hear it. But what I will discuss are MGM movies from that year that he saw fit to cite. So he's got Not So Dumb, which is a movie that we discussed the first time around. The famous George S. Kaufman, Mark Connolly play Dulcie was the basis for King Vidor's Not So Dumb. It was the third, after The Patsy and Show People, of Marion Davies' films with Vidor. Each time he brought out comic talents that normally didn't show up in Davies' performances, even though she was hardly a Lynn Fontaine, who had created the role on stage. Humorist Donald Ogden Stewart stood out in support. Script by Wanda Tuchok and Edwin Justice Mayer. And he's got his little section at the end of each year, 1-sentence zingers about other forgotten 1930 pictures to note. He has The Divorcee, where he says, The Divorcee, Norma Shearer, Robert Montgomery, Chester Morris, was considered daring for its day. The gay 90s were pleasantly reincarnated in Marion Davies' Florodora Girl. And that's it.
I'm not sure I understand why he said that comic qualities are not usually associated with Marion Davies. I thought she was known as a comedian. King Vidor, who's not really known for his comedies.
Well, usually when you read about Marion Davies, people are up in arms about the fact that she rarely got a chance to be in comedies, although we've seen a few.
Well, I think she made quite a few comedies, but then she was being pushed into costume melodramas to compete with Norma Shearer or whatever by Hearst.
Before we go into the movies, let's pull back here and let's talk about all of the movies we saw for round 1 of MGM from 1930 to 1948. I'm going to read off the list.
You're going to read the whole list, and then what are we going to do?
Then we're going to give our impressions.
I thought we had to do a top 10 or something.
Yeah, we'll do that afterwards. That's what we did last time. Starting chronologically from 1930, we discussed The Bishop Murder Case, Not So Dumb, Possessed, Susan Lennox, Her Fall and Rise, Red Dust, Red-Headed Woman, Penthouse, The Stranger's Return, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, The Merry Widow, David Copperfield, A Tale of Two Cities, Wife vs. Secretary, Libeled Lady, Conquest, Parnell, Too Hot to Handle, Test Pilot, Babes in Arms, Miracles for Sale, Northwest Passage, Strange Cargo, A Woman's Face, The Trial of Mary Dugan, Woman of the Year, Tortilla Flat, The Human Comedy, Lassie Come Home, Song of Russia, Kismet, The Clock, Yolanda and the Thief, A Letter for Evie, Two Smart People, Cynthia, High Wall, Easter Parade, and Summer Holiday. We're just gonna think a little bit here, maybe out loud, about this random selection of films. Did it alter our impressions of the studio? And just as a quick signpost, we might want to cite Ethan Morden's idea of MGM as presented in the Hollywood Studios, which is a book that we covered. I don't think he's too revolutionary in discussing MGM. He boils it down to glamour.
Yeah, of course that doesn't hold through the 1940s.
No, not really. They get pretty backyardy.
And Warner Brothers gets quite glamorous.
That's true. But the movies that we saw here, do they cohere as a body of work in your mind?
No, and they also don't. Like when I'm looking at this list of movies randomly selected, well, not quite randomly because...
Well, no, of course not.
Sometimes our preferences are involved, at least half the time. But they also don't scream glamour to me. Not on the whole, not overall, not more than any other studio, not more than Paramount.
It's true, we didn't do Grand Hotel, we didn't do Dinner at 8, those massive star congregations that people associated with MGM at the time. We didn't even do San Francisco.
Why don't you give me your list, and then I'll talk to you about my list and what ideas I did draw from it.
Can't do a top 10, and I'm starting to really hate that part of this because I loved so many of these movies, way too many of them. I'll just let you know that I gave 5 stars on Letterboxd to 14 movies out of this list of 38.
Fair. That seems conservative by your standards, but okay.
So I'll read all of those off. This is not in any particular order. Red Dust, Red-Headed Woman, The Stranger's Return, which is on my top 4 Letterboxd items. So I guess I'd have to put that one number 1.
Of all time?
Currently, that's what's there. The Merry Widow, David Copperfield, Tale of Two Cities, Parnell, Test Pilot, Strange Cargo, A Woman's Face, The Human Comedy, Lassie Come Home, The Clock, and Yolanda and the Thief. I've even got honorable mentions for Libeled Lady, Possessed, Susan Lennox, Her Fall and Rise, Conquest, Northwest Passage, Tortilla Flat, A Letter for Evie.
What are these, 4 stars or 4.5?
Yeah, 4.5, and High Wall. So that's like more than half I just absolutely love. Elise, you're a more discerning viewer. Let's have your top 10.
I don't know about stars. Our impressions of the best movies from this list aren't by any means radically different. You like The Human Comedy. I enjoy The Human Comedy, but you really love it. So I'd say that's a point of departure. I'm sure it's not possible for me to love The Stranger's Return as much as you do. I did like it a lot. But yeah, there's not a great deal of difference here, so I'll just give you my top 5. I think I can solidly stand by these as my 5 favorites from this group. Not really in any particular order. Strange Cargo, The Clock, A Woman's Face, Red Dust, and Test Pilot.
Those are good.
Ones I wasn't so enchanted with, I can list off as well. Song of Russia was weird. Kismet was kind of a dud. Northwest Passage was hard to watch, although we decided that had some Verhoeven qualities, I think.
Oh yeah, I think it's an impressive movie, despite some hateful aspects, for sure.
Too Hot to Handle was a very mixed bag because of some hateful aspects. Being paired up with a terrific romantic comedy, so that's a difficult one. Bishop Murder Case, we discussed at the time, was kind of a barely functioning movie, although with some very impressive visuals. That's from the 1930 episode. Since our feelings about the quality of the movies don't differ radically, let me ask you, did they change your impression of MGM as a studio, or what your feelings were about it originally?
Well, one thing that almost always comes up is that MGM was not a director's studio. Paramount, I think, will often get the nod as the best place to be. If you're an independent-minded director in the 1930s and you're working at a studio, well, number 1 would be Capra at Columbia. But if you're talking about a big studio, Paramount was a lot more hands-off. But when you look at this list, there's some pretty amazing auteur efforts on there. The standard view of MGM as a bad place for an auteur, well, some really weird auteurist pieces are on this list, like Yolanda and the Thief, A Woman's Face, I would say, Strange Cargo, definitely.
The Clock?
Yeah, The Stranger's Return. Parnell is a really out-of-nowhere effort by John Stahl.
Yeah, it didn't go anywhere either.
No, it didn't do well, and I guess you could say MGM probably failed in promoting it. I mean, Clarence Brown, not typically thought of as an auteur, but I don't know what you call the human comedy if you don't call it the strange product of Clarence Brown's imagination, obviously in collaboration with William Saroyan.
I've got Possessed in my top 10. That's another Clarence Brown. I was also having thoughts of MGM versus Paramount, and I don't think that's only because we've already done an overview of our first round of Paramount. I can't remember the order that I put my favorite studios in that long ago first episode. I know that Warner Brothers was number 1, and so far I would still stand by that. We'll see how I feel about it when we actually do the Warner Brothers overview. But I think I put Paramount as number 2, and that would be on the strength of its auteurs.
Yeah, Sternberg, Lubitsch.
Sternberg, who won't be in any of our rounds of Paramount.
We did all of his Marlene Dietrich movies as a standalone special subject.
Yeah, because there was a retrospective at TIFF, right when we were starting the podcast. Sternberg, Lubitsch,
Sturges later on.
Sturges, Wilder later on, and Mamoulian at the beginning of the 30s, and Mitchell Leisen as well. We both really stand up for him as an auteur. If I'm just comparing the first rounds of Paramount and MGM, who knows how we're going to feel in subsequent rounds? Our opinions might alter again. If I'm just comparing the first rounds, I would say that Paramount feels like a studio that is more reliant on its auteurs, whereas MGM feels like a studio that's more consistent in terms of the quality of its films. And partly that may be because they have this variety of strong directors who aren't necessarily, all of them, maybe as blisteringly original as the Paramount auteurs. Although the ones who are, like Borzage, of course, he's not exclusive to MGM, right?
No, but the fact that he was able to work there and turn out something like Strange Cargo, it just doesn't feel like part of the mainstream narrative that you get about MGM.
But then you've got directors like Victor Fleming and Clarence Brown and George Cukor, who aren't always thought of as auteurs, but they're producing films that are just as good as anything made by the great Paramount auteurs. And Victor Fleming is here in my top 5 twice.
Yeah, Red Dust and Test Pilot. These are really impressive movies. Victor Fleming unfortunately gets a bad rap. We've talked about this before a little bit, but the fact that he got called in as part of the team that finished off Gone with the Wind, and he was involved in some direction by committee on Wizard of Oz. Those are the 2 movies that people know him from, and those are the movies that he had the least to do with, really. If you really want to think about Victor Fleming, you got to see Test Pilot, you got to see Red Dust, you got to see his movies with Clara Bow.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So this is the idea of the studios, or 3 of the major studios anyway, that I'm forming as we're going into the second round, and we'll see if subsequent episodes challenge this. I feel like Paramount is very reliant on a few brilliant auteurs. Of course, there's also a lot of standard Paramount comedies that we're avoiding on purpose. I don't know that they will radically alter our opinion if we get to them. And then MGM just has a very strong overall roster of directors and stars, in greater number perhaps than Paramount. Warner Brothers, for all that they have some great directors working for them or appearing under their auspices, like William Wyler. As I keep saying about Warner Brothers, by the 1940s it feels like they have such a strong house style that they don't need directors. So this is how I feel about the 3 studios and their relationship to directors. What is your reaction to that?
There you do get into a question of how big of a part of that house style that you're talking about is Michael Curtiz as a director. I mean, he directed a lot of the most important movies there. Is he just part of the overall excellence of the studio, or is he really pushing it forward?
Well, I don't know. Is Michael Curtiz somehow responsible for Humoresque and Curtis Bernhardt's Possessed? Or Irving Rapper's Now Voyager? This is what I'm talking about.
Right. I mean, one of the big stories at MGM, once you get into the 40s, is the Freed unit. Now, we didn't engage with it that much on our first go-around. In fact, kind of a perverse engagement with the Freed unit by going with Yolanda and the Thief.
Oh, we also did Easter Parade.
That's true. And Summer Holiday, yeah.
Well, Summer Holiday may be perverse, but Easter Parade is commonly acknowledged classic and truly great movie.
It is, yeah.
A way to summarize what I just said is auteurs are great. If you want to talk about an auteur as a director who is very original in their style, very consistent with their themes, also allowed a lot of freedom from their studio, whether or not they are also doing the producing and writing, and whether or not they're taking credit for those things. So with Paramount, the people we talked about at Paramount, well, I don't know about Lubitsch being consistent with his themes, but a lot of those things can be said for the main directors that we mentioned at Paramount. Auteurs are great, in other words, but if you look at MGM with their more various roster of strong directors, if you look at Warner Brothers, where, as I say, the concept of a strong director by the 40s just goes out of the window, because when they're producing movies as consistently great as they are, stylish, glamorous, noirish melodramas, by directors who otherwise don't have particularly impressive filmographies, then that concept just goes out the window. So auteurs are great, but auteurs are not necessarily the backbone of great studio-era Hollywood filmmaking. So that's the first thing I'd throw out there. Keep that in mind, Dave, in case you want to respond to it. And then in terms of stars and MGM, because it is supposed to be the studio of glamour, at least in the 1930s, the studio with all the stars, again, at least in the 1930s, although they produced some very impressive stars thanks to the Freed unit in the 1940s.
Like Lucille Bremer?
I was thinking more of Fred Astaire.
Well, they didn't produce Fred Astaire, but they exhibited him, for sure.
Yeah, and Gene Kelly and Judy Garland. Those are still some pretty big stars.
Yeah, well, Judy Garland definitely is developed in-house.
But when you're looking at these great 1930s films in particular, so we're talking about a lot of Crawford and Gable and Spencer Tracy, a lot of Myrna Loy and Jean Harlow appearing in some really great movies. Stars, yes. Glamour, sure, of a sort, but these actors, and I think we brought this up. We brought this up during the first round of MGM. I can distinctly hear you in my mind bringing this up more than once. But all of these stars I just mentioned, with the possible exception of Myrna Loy, carry a strong proletariat, a strong working class association.
Yeah, it's true. It's not all sparkling upper crust entertainment. Anytime Jean Harlow is involved, she's bringing class critique with her. Clark Gable, their biggest star, he can play a professional man or a magnate.
But he still always feels like the Clark Gable of It Happened One Night, at least retrospectively he does.
Definitely got a breezy manner about him, and he doesn't seem to be all that caught up in the trappings of bourgeois esteem.
In a way that maybe Cary Grant plays such a variety of things. But when you think of Cary Grant, you think of Cary Grant as
a wealthy playboy.
Even though he's also Walter Burns, and even though he's also the weirdo professor in Bringing Up Baby, right?
None but the Lonely Heart. But I do take your point. The auteur directors at Paramount are more flamboyantly insisting upon themselves as auteurs. They're more going for the Capra name above the title kind of thing. At MGM, the consistent long-term auteurs working for them. I mean, because I really do feel like Victor Fleming and Clarence Brown feel like auteurs to me, but they're not name above the title people. They're not people who are going to insist upon drawing attention to themselves in the same way.
And even Cukor is thought of as a guy who certainly was in the books I read when I was young about Hollywood, thought of as a guy who's mostly just bringing a sure and glamorous touch to material based on stage plays.
And the people like Frank Borzage and King Vidor that are unquestioned immortal titans of auteurism, they're not consistently at MGM, even though they're making really strange movies for the studio that probably only they could have gotten away with making. Still not a huge production being made out of what they're doing. The one exception to that is very early on, outside of the scope of Hollywood studios year by year, which is The Crowd. That one, MGM talked consistently about how they were letting King Vidor lose money because this was a gift to culture. But that's not how they talk about things like The Stranger's Return. It just winds up being a movie on the docket that comes and goes. Although, for me, it is a thing of absolute magnificence.
You can mention, in connection with MGM, if we don't want to talk about directors as auteurs there, or not in the same way as at Paramount anyhow. You could talk about Thalberg and Selznick, but as great as the movies that they were involved with in this list, particularly with Selznick, you think about
The Two Dickens.
As great as those movies are, they're just a little blip of greatness among so much other greatness. So again, I just want to insist, and the reason I insist on this is not to try to offend any other cinephiles who might be listening to this podcast, but because my own shaping as a cinephile has been through the discourse, I don't even know if this is still the case for people younger than I am, has been so shaped through the discourse of auteurism that it comes as a surprise to me, thinking through the movies that we've watched for this series and other movies that we've watched for the film podcast. I have to impress it upon myself that the greatness of studio era cinema is not reliant upon auteur directors, although I would never want to sacrifice any of them.
Fair enough. I guess one last thing that I didn't think to mention earlier is that it's kind of surprising every time I think about it, and I'm sure we talked about this at the time. Out of all of the Lubitsch, Chevalier, MacDonald movies, to me it's not even a competition. The best one is The Merry Widow, and that's the one that he didn't make at Paramount.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's his greatest film, because you do have Trouble in Paradise to contend there. You've got The Shop Around the Corner, but that's also at MGM. So Lubitsch seems to have been right at home at MGM, despite being as deeply linked with Paramount as someone like Cecil B. DeMille is.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, Lubitsch, just as a presence, even before he had a production for a while, but even just as a presence at Paramount really helped establish the tone of the studio, right? But in terms of my own preferences with his films, like my favorites are Shop Around the Corner, To Be or Not to Be.
Which is not made by a studio at all. That's an independent production.
Ninotchka's at MGM.
That's right.
That's a favorite. Yeah, and The Merry Widow. I guess my favorite of his movies made at Paramount is, Trouble in Paradise.
Yeah, well, that is the best one, I think. Out of the Paramounts.
Yeah, so he is so strongly associated with Paramount, and rightly so, because I think you don't get Sturges necessarily. Wilder and Leisen are, well, obviously Wilder, because he was writing for Lubitsch. They're all coming out of this milieu. Lubitsch is just absolutely essential to Paramount and to Paramount auteurism.
Well, he was so essential that they made him the head of the studio for 1 year.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
And then he quit, right? He didn't like doing that. I don't blame him.
But yeah, his impact on Paramount, anyway, for me, isn't necessarily reliant on the movies that he himself made there.
If you're looking at the relationship between Paramount and MGM through the lens of the Marx Brothers, I mean, that's where you get the more traditional narrative. It's the classic example that people will go to all the time. At Paramount, the Marx Brothers are unhinged. They're bringing anarchic energy of their Broadway shows to Hollywood, and people are at first amazed and then just dazed and then don't know what to do with it. Brothers are kind of lost at sea, although Duck Soup was never the failure that people tried to make it out to be, but it wasn't as massive a hit as the first couple of Paramounts. Then MGM, Thalberg takes them under his wing, and they make A Night at the Opera at MGM, which is a much more tightly controlled entertainment, a producer's film. And it's a big hit, but Marx Brothers devotees are of two minds about Night at the Opera. They can't deny its quality, but they deplore the trajectory that it puts the Marx Brothers on. And Day at the Races, Thalberg starts to put that one together and dies while it's being made. And it's got some great things in it, but it's even more of, a monumental MGM production. It's by far the longest Marx Brothers movie, and it's got all kinds of things in it that have nothing to do with the Marx Brothers. And then after that, all their other MGM movies range from not so great to almost insulting to have to acknowledge the existence of. And so people will look at that and they'll say MGM is where individualistic talents go to die, right?
That sounds like too much of a generalization.
It is, and it doesn't work in a lot of these other cases that we've encountered.
Paramount Paramount is also, of course, the studio of comedy, both of sophisticated comedy, genius comedy, and a lot of lowbrow comedy that we have been avoiding. How does MGM fare on the comedy front? There's not a lot of laugh out loud funny movies here. Of course, Jean Harlow, even in a melodrama, can bring the comedy, and Red-Headed Woman is pretty hilarious, as well as terrifying at times.
Yeah, Jean Harlow's in some amazing comedies. Bombshell, a movie we haven't covered for the series yet, but one of the best comedies of the 30s, again directed by Victor Fleming.
Woman of the Year, when it's not being shrilly melodramatic and misogynist, is undeniably hilarious. Of course, that is because of George Stevens.
We've got all the Powell and Loy movies, almost all of which are comedies of one kind or another. Libeled Lady is often presented as the archetypal mid-1930s non-auteur screwball comedy. And it is a great movie, although I only gave it 4.5 stars.
So we didn't do Philadelphia Story.
Not yet, no.
In that round. But yeah, Katharine Hepburn appearing in the 1940s helps give sophisticated comedy lift. But as you say, this is a different kind of sophisticated comedy is going on with Myrna Loy and William Powell. Those are two very high-powered comedy star duos, which is something you don't see at Paramount. Unless you're...
Hope and Crosby.
Exactly, unless you're counting Hope and Crosby. Yeah, Tracy and Hepburn and Loy and Powell. Another thing we could mention in this discussion is one of the most undeniable idiosyncratic MGM auteurs really spills over, can only be talked about in his auteurism if you're also including the 1950s, which is Vincente Minnelli.
Well, yeah, but I think making Yolanda and the Thief qualifies you as an auteur, even if that's the only movie you ever made.
I feel the same way about The Clock, even.
Yes, of course. I love The Clock, although Yolanda and the Thief just feels like more of an auteurist curveball because nobody wanted this movie, really, I don't think, and nobody liked it at the time. The Clock was very popular, despite being a unique production as well. Only Vincente Minnelli wanted Yolanda and the Thief, and I'm glad he made it because I love it.
Remind me, where did The Barretts of Wimpole Street fall in your categorization?
Oh, I like it a lot, but it didn't get up to the top there.
I ended up putting it in my somewhat arbitrary top 10, just because on reviewing some of these movies I have only seen once, and I mentioned this in the Paramount episode as well, review of the first round. It gives me tragic feelings looking over this list of movies, looking at the ones I've only seen once and that I've already almost completely forgotten, and knowing that I will probably never see them again.
Well, we'll do our best to keep rewatching things.
But we don't. We intend to read, we intend to write, we are forced to work, we keep plowing on and on.
We keep getting closer to death.
No, I'm not talking about death. Well, that too. But we keep plowing on and on, trying to watch more new movies, trying to investigate what's out there in the past, in the present, well, less in the present, but in the recent past, as well as the more distant past. But when I was reviewing the plot of The Barretts of Wimpole Street, of this particular version of it, to try to remind myself of the movie, I was shocked all over again in memory by Charles Laughton's character and his performance in that movie. Do you remember how absolutely psychotic they were?
Of course.
Particularly compared to the Jennifer Jones version, which was also very good and very disturbing, but not half as disturbing. Obviously, it originated with Thalberg. It was a costume drama based on a quality play, but it felt like a pre-code in the best sense of a movie dealing with disturbing themes in an adult way that is maybe never seen in American cinema again. And certainly not mainstream Hollywood American cinema.
Yet another unique production from MGM, not just a cookie cutter place.
Not even when doing historical dramas.
All right, let's dive into the films themselves for our first crack at MGM Round 2. The Florodora Girl. I'm going to open with John Douglas Eames and his write-up from the MGM story. The life of Marion Davies was like an MGM movie, so what could be more logical than to film scenes for her 1930 musical The Florodora Girl / The Gay 90s at this, her own home. One of her homes, rather. The Santa Monica Beach House with 118 rooms and 55 bathrooms. Marion also had a mansion in Beverly Hills and a slightly smaller one on the MGM lot called her dressing room bungalow, where she was hostess to visiting royalty, Winston Churchill, Bernard Shaw, and such like. Furthermore, she was mistress of multimillionaire William Randolph Hearst's gigantic California estate, San Simeon. She was also mistress of Hearst, and had been since she was a Broadway chorus girl in 1918. Amazingly, she remained totally unspoiled, a generous, friendly, sunny character liked even by her more talented Hollywood rivals. The Florodora Girl was a broad satire of the 90s, brightly written by Gene Markey and directed by Harry Beaumont, with Lawrence Gray, Ilka Chase, Walter Catlett, and Claude Allister. Well, they didn't waste any time getting to the usual chestnuts about Marion Davies. They spent half the time talking about her off-screen life there instead of the movie.
Suggesting that she was untalented.
Yeah, it's annoying.
Yeah, Marion Davies is a perfectly charming comedian with a very distinctive look. Probably because we just, for New Year's, watched 200 Cigarettes. She was really reminding me, and also she keeps falling on her face in this movie, she was really reminding me of Kate Hudson.
I could see that. Yeah, I thought this was a very enjoyable movie. I guess maybe to double back on the Joel W. Findler 1-star rating that he gave her. I guess the thing that might be holding this movie back a little is that she doesn't have much of a leading man to play off of. Lawrence Gray? I don't know this guy at all. He was okay.
Is this just because she's off in her own production unit? She didn't have access to the other leading men, or none of them fit the picture? Of course, they don't exist yet. It's 1930. Clark Gable doesn't exist.
No, and she does wind up in movies with people like Leslie Howard. She even does a movie with Clark Gable. I don't know enough about the office politics at MGM, but I do get the impression that since this was a separate unit that was funded by Hearst, MGM didn't want to waste their other big stars, for the most part, on Marion Davies movies. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe Hearst didn't want anyone upstaging Marion Davies, or who knows. But for one reason or another, you get things like this occasionally, where second most recognizable person in the movie is Walter Catlett.
Who was in Blondie of the Follies with her? Let's take a look.
Yeah, Robert Montgomery.
Yeah, so that's a decent...
For sure. It's not like it never happened.
But the most important person she's playing off of in Blondie of the Follies is her best friend. But we're here to talk about the Florodora Girl.
It does explore the friendship between these women.
This movie is in pretty good shape for a 1930 MGM sound film. We did talk about them the last time we did MGM 1930. That was the Bishop murder case, and we did talk about MGM maybe being a little backward, like not catching on to sound as quickly as some of the other studios, not figuring out what they were doing, and that really seems to impact Madame Satan. This movie's doing pretty well for 1930, and I was astonished by the location filming of the seaside. I mean, it's not all location. You can tell they're going back and forth between location and set, but the location seaside filming does have sound that sounds perfectly good. And it's looking back nostalgically at the turn of the century from the vantage point of 1930.
So yeah, the gay 90s was like the 80s to us.
Yeah, except that you do feel the cultural changes are much more dramatic.
I don't know about that. The 80s were pretty dramatically different from our current day.
See, I don't feel that way at all. I feel like, okay, if you're in the 1960s looking back at the 1930s, that's a huge culture shock. And I guess if you've gone through the 1920s and you're now looking back at the turn of the century, that is as well. But despite even the fact that, we had no internet in the 1980s and everybody had really stupid hair and shoulder pads, I still don't feel like there's that dramatic a gap as is represented in this movie.
Well, you know what the difference is? You lived through it. So it all feels seamless and part of your life. And I think that's how it felt to people in the early 1930s. A lot of still fairly young adults had memories of the 1890s. There are so many movies from this first decade of sound film that look back nostalgically upon the 1890s. And sure, they're pointing out the ways that things have changed, like horseless carriages are barely a thing.
What would the equivalent of that be? Oh, haha, remember when we all had flip phones?
No internet internet. You toss that off like that's not a big deal. Every aspect of our life is controlled by the internet now.
Sure, but how would you represent having no internet as opposed to having a very early type of car? That's what I'm saying. How would you represent the very early technology?
Well, you would talk about Usenet or something, right? Which is the precursor.
Who used Usenet? Nobody knew about Usenet. It wasn't like the horseless carriage. It wasn't like everybody was gathered around to be like, oh my god, look at this person who's got Usenet.
Well, no, people knew about modems.
Who cared about a modem?
Well, nobody had a horseless carriage in the 1890s either, right? It was a very rare thing.
What was that period of the phone where you could take it off its stand and move it around the house?
Cordless phones.
Cordless phones. That's what I wanted to say. A cordless phone, everybody like expressing the wonder of a cordless phone, maybe.
Yeah, sure, there's a lot of stuff like that. I do feel like this movie, it's relying on the fact that these strange things from bygone days are also quite familiar to at least half of the people in the audience because they lived through them.
So you think when Marion Davies is putting on that absolutely ridiculous outfit with the giant puffy shoulders, right? That jacket over her top, over her giant skirt. You think that's just like when we're watching When Harry Met Sally and we're like, oh my god, what is that outfit that Meg Ryan is wearing?
Yeah, I think so.
That movie itself, she is looking back on her college style in the movie.
Yeah, that's right.
Which would only be, I don't know,
12 years.
Yeah, 12 years in the movie's time, but she already feels like radical fashion changes have taken place.
Well, they had. It doesn't take long. Another interesting aspect of the gay 90s nostalgia craze, which, again, it persists all the way into the 40s, right? You've got one of my favorite movies, The Strawberry Blonde, which is sort of part of this genre in a way. Everyone's breaking out into song. There's barbershop quartets, entertainment palaces, and gaiety.
The write-up that you just read says that this is a musical, but the version that we have is not a musical.
Well, there's singing in it.
Some.
There's singing in both of our movies, and that's something that you often will hear, and that it does seem to be fairly true about movies in 1930. If there's any way to squeeze a song in, they will.
But Wikipedia says the two-strip Technicolor finale has survived, including Tell Me Pretty Maiden from the original musical, Florodora. That is not in this movie.
No.
Neither the Technicolor nor the song. It is much less musical than it was originally. Do you know the Florodora backstory, Dave?
Not at all, no.
So this was a big hit musical, originally in England and then on Broadway in 1900. Its success was attributed to the chorus of lovely women that became known as the Florodora Girls.
So this is the template for the Ziegfeld Girls and all the other iterations of that would follow the Goldwyn Girls.
Perhaps in its very distinctly Edwardian way. That's who Marion Davies is playing in this movie. She's one of the Florodora Girls. A good part of the success of the musical was attributed to its choreans called the English Girls in the score, but soon popularly dubbed the Florodora Girls. They consisted of a, this is in quotes, sextet of tall, gorgeous damsels clad in pink walking costumes, black picture hats, and carrying frilly parasols who swished onto the stage and captivated New York. For no other reason than that they were utterly stunning. These tall women, by the way, it's specified, were about 5'4". Massive Amazonian women.
And Marion Davies, they do make a point of saying that she is the last of the original 6 Florodora girls. Everyone else has left to get married.
Apparently more than 70 women played these roles of a sextet in the first run of the play. I was going to say each of the original sextet, apparently, it was said, married a millionaire. So this is what we see, all of these women pursuing rich men and vice versa because of the fame that they've gathered from being in this popular musical.
But Marion Davies is sort of the odd one out in the group because she never has a date. She says that she doesn't know how to fascinate a man.
Right, so she's the innocent girl next door.
And she's getting advice from, her pals. She's got 2 really good friends out of the group, and she also has some not so nice bullies in the group who get their comeuppance. Not from her, but from her enforcers.
We've seen this trope a billion times. The innocent girl who hooks a man who's out of her league because of her innocence and who's getting bad advice about how to captivate a man from her more knowing girlfriends.
Well, they tell her basically a variation on the rules. You have to play hard to get. I guess that's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
And occasionally haul off and punch the guy.
Usually with this trope, you will see this bad advice creating more obstacles than it does here.
Well, it does keep them apart for a fair bit. In fact, her friends are right. This guy does only want to use her for sex originally. I mean, he finally comes around, but if she hadn't followed their rules, things might have gone a much less pleasant way.
Well, he comes around because she turns him down, and he discovers that she really is a girl of quality.
Yeah. And that's not an unusual storyline. It is well done here, at least on her part. I had some real problems, not so much with this actor, although I didn't find him memorable in any way. The way he's written makes very little sense. He's got a serious gambling problem.
Yep,
that
that's
almost
true.
destroys his entire family. Makes paupers of this rotogravure family.
Sure, but we're meant to believe that he's actually right to bet the family fortune on this horse. It's just the fact that...
Well, he's not right because races are often fixed by people like the criminal Sam Hardy.
Yeah, but if it weren't for that, this guy could, make a real honest living as a horse race gambler. But yeah, I mean, the guy who interferes with the race and who harasses Marion Davies, he is literally a mustache-twirling villain. I also waited for more to be done with that character, but no, he just shows up, twirls his mustache, creates a little bit of a problem. It never really ends up heavily impacting the plot. Her own boyfriend of her own class is revolting, physically revolting, and as a character, he is revolting.
Yes.
So that's really how her upper-class beau gets any kind of appeal that he has, is by contrast.
Well, she likes his refined ways. She's not so much looking for a millionaire. Anyway, that's what she says, and I think we should believe her because she's not supposed to be a duplicitous character.
Well, except when she pretends to be drowning so that he'll rescue her.
No, that's true, but that's very innocent duplicity.
Probably my favorite scene is the one where she's talking over her new crush with her father, with her Irish alcoholic father.
Yeah, I wish we had seen more stuff with the father. That would have brought back a kind of distaff version of the Strawberry Blonde.
The best joke in the whole movie, as far as I'm concerned, is where the father is talking about the horse and Marion Davies thinks that he's talking about her crush.
Yeah.
Look at the legs on him! Oh, I know!
Yeah, that scene was great. The structure of the movie was a little bit off.
There's no great dramatic structure going on here. It's also not very funny. The jokes are not great.
No, they're not great. She's a very winning character.
Oh no, she's very, very appealing. That's why I was thinking of Kate Hudson. There's a point in the movie where she actually falls on her head, which was cute. But yeah, I mean, it's not a great movie. It's not a great screenplay. It relies entirely on Marion Davies' charm and on that gay 90s nostalgia. Ha ha ha, riding in a two-seated bicycle. Ha ha ha, horseless carriage. It's very hard to get to work. And look at all of the silly outfits people are wearing. Look at, we're in our swimming costumes and we're completely covered from head to toe and we're talking about how naked we feel.
Sure. I did find the ending, the final movement of the film, quite affecting.
How so?
It's all a dynamic that develops between Marion Davies and not the guy, but his mother. Those scenes are pretty good. Again, reminiscent of scenes encountered in other movies.
It's quite a twist in this case where the mother is not saying too low class to marry my son. It's that my son has gambled away all of our money and now he is completely reliant on marrying a rich woman, which turns out not to be true because he's a business genius on top of everything else. Why was he doing this horse race gambling in the first place when he's a business giant in the making?
Yeah, well, all of that happens off screen. He's been living the life of a dandy, raising these horses, and as a backup, he's engaged to one of the richest women in New York, and when everything goes tits up at the racetrack, The idea is that he's going to have to marry this woman, even though he has now fallen in love with Marion Davies. But he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he just has a magic transformation and emerges from that as a beautiful, rich entrepreneur butterfly and comes back and gets her. That just seems like wish fulfillment at the end. But when you're in the midst of that storyline where these two women are commiserating, as you say, it's not like Waterloo Bridge where the mother is saying, no, I mean, you are a woman of fine quality, but you're just not right for my boy. You're going to ruin him or whatever. No, it's really like begging her, I and my other children are going to starve because we have no resources anymore and we have to just latch on parasitically to this dynastic alliance. And Marion Davies, out of the goodness of her heart, decides that this old woman's happiness is more important than hers. She engineers that scene where she's supposedly in love with Sam Hardy, which is appalling to watch. The mustache twirler. I mean, that's the only other thing he does in the movie, except for fix races, is be there and act gross at the exact right moment for her to drive Jack Vibart away.
Did you notice, though, in the final scene, the movie is so non-reliant on any kind of chemistry between Marion Davies and her leading man that in the final scene she is cuddling the mother as they drive off.
Yeah, that really is the relationship. Well, her relationship with her father, who I wanted to see more of, and her relationship with this mother-in-law.
And as I was, maybe this is a constant for Marion Davies, because as I was saying about Blondie of the Follies, the much more important relationship in the movie is between her and her female roommate and friend.
And in this movie, the funniest stuff comes from Fanny and Maud, and those are played by Ilka Chase and Vivian Oakland, dispensing the chorus girl wisdom and occasionally dispensing chorus girl justice when someone gets out of line, like beating a girl up in the alleyway who was mean to Marion Davies. They were great. I thought they were very funny.
So this was pleasant enough, but not a really exciting movie.
No, I would agree there. It's no threat to that top 14 that I presented.
How do we feel in terms of excitement about Madam Satan?
So let's get John Douglas Eames' take on the film from the MGM story. He says, the apex of cuckoo supercolossalness was achieved by Cecil B. DeMille's Madam Satan, a box office disaster.
Wait a minute, so what was that again? Cuckoo super...
Colossalness.
Colossalness. That was like a trend of which this was the apex?
Well, DeMille, maybe. A Little Pastry of a Plot by Jeannie McPherson, Gladys Unger, and Elsie Janis about marital jealousy was covered by layer upon layer of spectacular icing until it became indigestible even to DeMillions, for whom it was confected. Climax came in this scene, a costume party in a giant airship which was struck by lightning, obliging hundreds of guests to descend on New York by parachute. The stars were Kay Johnson and Reginald Denny, Lillian Roth and Roland Young. Miss Roth's hectic life made a much better movie. I'll Cry Tomorrow, 25 years later.
Maybe this movie was really ahead of its time, because it's kind of like... Although this makes it sound better than it is, but it's kind of like James Cameron made Eyes Wide Shut.
Although I agree, I don't think it's as good a movie as that makes it sound like it is.
Maybe it would have been better, though, if the whole party sequence had been in 2-strip Technicolor, which is how it was filmed.
Yeah, maybe.
But, I mean, part of the problem is that the party sequence isn't the entire movie, and everything leading up to it, which is almost an hour, is absolutely amateurish in terms of both the writing and the direction. It's really, really thin farce, directed almost like an Ed Wood movie. Like, Cecil doesn't seem to know what he's doing at all. Now, he's going to learn pretty fast. I mean, Sign of the Cross is great, and it's just a couple of years later, but in this movie, it's just a freaking mess.
Well, it's interesting, too, because he did come to prominence in the early 20s with those Gloria Swanson movies, and he must have, not that I've seen any of them, but he must have had at least a good sense in silent movies of how to direct scenes between actors who are just speaking to eeach other. Here it's a little iffy, as you say.
Yeah, the direction seems, of the actors, of the scenes, is amateurish.
Yeah, I guess getting used to sound, yeah.
It's just thrown him off completely, even though he has specific dialogue writers as well as his usual scenarist, Jeannie McPherson. Now, the fact that so much of this is so amateurish seeming, it gives an additionally surreal quality to the comedic special effects of the parachute landings. Don't you agree? They'd be surrealistic enough if the special effects were successful by today's standards, but the fact that they're not at all makes it even more surreal.
Oh, sure.
The people just floating through the air as cutouts against a black backdrop. Like, it's insane!
They become see-through.
Yeah, at points they become see-through, yes.
I wouldn't mind a little intangible skydiving.
And yeah, the whole sequence of the struck by lightning blimp for no reason. What can I say about this movie? On the one hand, the blimp party, everything that happens on it, the lightning bolt dance, the ridiculous costumes, and also amateurishly directed. Like there's all these women doing a fashion show, and maybe this is where Mitchell Leisen came in, because apparently he co-directed it.
He was the assistant director to DeMille for a little while there.
Yeah, so maybe he's probably involved in costumes and the whole masquerade party sequence, because early on, Leisen's emphasis in film was on the visuals. But even the women in their ludicrous costumes, they seem to be unable to walk down the stairs without stumbling. It's like the Ed Wood one take. Like, I don't know what was going on here.
Well, I saw this movie once before, I guess in my teens. It was on VHS and I had rented it. I remembered it seeming a lot more like some kind of Jeremiad or dark parable about the dismal trend of society in the late 20s or early 30s.
No, I think it is. Obviously, there's some veneer of that.
But it's so unskillfully done that none of the critique seems like it's registering. And what is the critique?
Everybody's decadent.
Yeah, I know, but the movie doesn't seem to...
And then the blimp crashes just the Wall Street.
Yeah, I know, but it just doesn't feel coherent. It doesn't feel like it has the elan of real righteous wrath behind it, which you would think at least DeMille could muster that. But I don't feel the intense satirical disapproval of these people. It just feels a little bit too lost for that.
Well, no, because DeMille's into this sort of stuff, isn't he?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
The two DeMilles are clashing in a way that isn't very coherent. Is that what you're trying to say? The righteous wrath DeMille and the kinky sex DeMille?
Yeah, but that all works together perfectly in something like The Sign of the Cross, right? But here, it just seems like, well, these people are silly and they go through a little bit of a tough experience in the skies there, but nobody dies and everything's fine by the end. It doesn't seem like someone railing against imminent disaster for society, but that's kind of what it would have to be for this movie to have any merit.
Well, as I said, that's where the James Cameron comparison comes in that the spectacular nature of the movie combined with its absolute silliness. I mean, I think that's, somewhere in the James Cameron department, but the lack of skill. The silliness of the concept together with the amateurishness of the execution.
Something like Titanic, it's not a favorite movie of mine or anything, but it certainly is looking at the problems with the class society that produced Titanic, right? And it is using Titanic in that way that you just need a disaster movie to use its disaster. Here, it's kind of a disaster averted anyway, because the only thing that gets wrecked is the blimp, not any of the people.
Also, if there's any kind of attempt to... And there is a superficial one. If there's any kind of an attempt here to offer class criticism, that's in conflict with the movie's main thrust, which is the Eyes Wide Shut plot. We can both blame and praise the entirely female roster of writers here. I would say that by the end, as unskillful as the farcical comedy is, that is the movie's first hour, as ridiculous as the whole party sequence concept is, there's a deceptive sophistication to the movie's analysis of gender and sexual politics that's apparent by the end. The movie seems like it's just going to be a competition and a catfight between these two women, but by the movie's final scene, and also a lot of crazy shit that happens on the blimp, it's apparent that the sexual problem in the marriage is a gender role problem. The husband husband and wife are still figuring ways to work that out by the end of it between them. And so it's not about the two women, it's about what's going on between the husband and the wife, and by the end they have realized that.
Yeah, and Kay Johnson gives her parachute to Lillian Roth, her arch enemy.
Right, and that's like Lillian Roth's worst moment because she's such an asshole about it. She actually reveals, right, that she chooses that moment to reveal that Kay Johnson was the woman under the covers in the farce sequence.
Well, that needed to come out. I think it was probably for the best.
But the movie doesn't even have it in for Lillian Roth despite that, because she has that absolutely hilarious, now that's a moment of comedy that does land, that absolutely hilarious final scene of her landing in the Turkish bath.
Yeah, with these stupid men. All they do apparently at this Turkish bath is talk about how they're so glad to be away from women.
And her hilarious reaction, right? Where she's kind of tittering and mock covering her face.
I love Lillian Roth. She's certainly a bright spot in this movie for me. The two leads, Kay Johnson, I know that she persists in films, but she's not a big star after this. She's in Frank Capra's American Madness. She plays Walter Houston's wife in that one.
Yeah, she's not a betrayed wife in that one, but
she's a betraying wife.
She is, well, not really. Thinking about it. But she is the wife who's being taken for granted, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's kind of what she got pigeonholed as. Here it's a star role, there it's a demotion, and I think it just got worse for her. Reginald Denny's an actor that I love as a character actor. He's amazing in Rebecca as Frank Crawley and immortal in Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House as Mr. Sims. The fact that I remember these characters' names means a lot, I think. But I don't find him all that compelling as a leading man, and he wouldn't be one for much longer. Roland Young is always amusing.
Yeah, but barely.
I mean, this is not Topper or Lubitsch.
I was going to say that if Roland Young can't even be funny in this movie, that's an indicator of how poor the comedy really is.
Uncle Willie.
What did you think of the progression of the relationship between husband and Madam Satan on the blimp?
It's pretty strange.
It's very, very strange. Definitely very pre-code. So she manages to fascinate him, but then indicates that she's really a good woman after all. She's not the sexual libertine that she appears to be, not the great sinner. And he likes that even better. But then as soon as he finds out through more farcical shenanigans with Roland Young and Lillian Roth, I'm not even going to get into all of the confusions that happen that lead Roland Young to assert that he's with Madam Satan, or whatever the hell happens. Do you remember what happens? I don't know.
The plot keeps making Roland Young pretend to be dating somebody, anybody. He's not dating anyone. All he's doing is giving giant parties in the sky. It's his blimp.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, and then Reginald Denny anyway gets the idea that Madam Satan is lying and she's a loose woman after all. Then he tries to rape her.
Yeah.
Whereupon she removes her mask and turns out to be his wife. See, I don't know if I should take the movie with enough psychological seriousness to try to parse that sequence out and what it means for their marriage.
It really should have been the last straw, if there hadn't been last straws all through the film with this idiot. But yeah, knowing that your husband, when he is alone in a room with a masked woman, is going to sexually assault her, you would think that would make him even less appealing than he already was.
But only if she's provoked him by cock-teasing him and then pretending to be a good woman, but then turning out to be a whore after all.
This should not have brought them closer together, but somehow it does.
I was going to say that the relationship reaches this ultimate impasse of ugliness at the same point that this disaster strikes. So, I don't know, the disaster could be a psychological representation, the impossible impasse of these gender roles. Even during the disaster, he doesn't come around to her. He's so horrified to find out that this woman that he was going to rape turns out to be his wife.
Whom he's been ignoring for a good long time, chasing after every other woman in New York.
That he stays mad at her even though they could both be dying.
True, but he does the chivalrous thing and forces her to parachute off, and he's the only person on the ship that has no parachute and has to dive out at the last minute into the reservoir of Central Park.
Yeah, but he tells her he's only doing that because she's unmanned him in every way, and it would be the final unmanning if she let him take the parachute.
Right. Or if they just somehow expired together on the ship, which is what she seems to want to do.
So he's even graceless about saving his wife's life.
Not a class act. But I guess you're right. This could be a way to tease out some gravitas. If the lightning bolt and the destruction of the blimp is a judgment upon gender relations writ large in America in 1929 or 1930.
Then in the final sequence, we see her trying to coax him around to reconciling the idea of finding his wife sexually attractive with her being his wife. And it's very difficult, but what I find interesting about that last sequence where she's on the piano is that compared to the timorous wife that we've seen through the whole movie, the timorous, long-suffering wife, here she is absolutely confident, and it feels like this Madame Satan identity has had a liberating effect on her. Do you see what I'm saying? She has this interesting mystery and smugness about her at the end that even he, completely against his will, is being charmed by. But then he remembers better. He remembers he's supposed to disapprove of these qualities in a wife. But she is trying to charm and enchant him into being able to reconcile them, not on a rational level, but on some other level that there's a chance that it might work for them erotically. And that, I think, is just at least as sexually sophisticated as Eyes Wide Shut.
You heard it here first.
But it's too bad the rest of the movie is such a goddamn mess. However, worth seeing just for the dance of the lightning bolt people.
Yeah.
That is some crazy Metropolis-influenced camp Art Deco nonsense.
I mean, when Roland Young puts on a party, he does not skim. He will even bring electricity beings into play.
He has no time to date.
No, I guess that's true. One of the parts of the movie that fascinated me was, as you say, this wife character played by Kay Johnson is supposedly incredibly timid and decorous. But the way she behaves, she just shows up at Lillian Roth's apartment and just horns in and refuses to leave, and she's pretty obnoxious. And I like those scenes where she's just making life difficult for everyone, forcing them to tell the most insane lies. Are we supposed to think that she knows they're lying? She says that she wants to meet Roland Young's wife, and she's already been told that that is Trixie, Lillian Roth. But does she really believe that this is Roland Young's wife? She forces them to prove it over and over again. She keeps barging into their room, and they have to go under the covers, get out of the covers, go under the covers.
She acts like she knows what's going on, definitely, but then also like she's disappointed when she has confirmation. So I think, there's a level of some thin layer of denial.
Yeah, I guess so. She's just praying that they're going to manage to find a way to fool her, which is interesting. And then when Reginald Denny shows up and starts bashing on Lillian Roth's door, I mean, that brings everything crumbling around everyone's ears. And then there's that scene where she just wanders into their bedroom. Like, her door opens onto their bedroom, and I did find that funny when she walks in. So there were a few scenes like that took me by surprise. Something strange that I don't think I've ever seen in any movie before was this wife in the midst of despair over her husband's complete lack of interest in her suddenly gets a song as a pep talk from her maid. And that maid never really comes back and does anything, but it's like a star moment for this maid. She sings this whole song. Elsa Peterson as Martha seems like she's gonna have a major role in the film, and she's gonna be like the voice of wisdom in song or something, but she never really comes back and does anything after that.
So imagine this version of this movie, Dave. Apparently DeMille originally wanted Dorothy Parker to, I guess, do the dialogue.
Well, that would have been interesting.
For Jeannie McPherson's script. Could she have teased out the brilliant psychological analysis of puritanical marital erotics?
It's one of those questions we'll never have an answer to.
In any case, there are musical numbers that, again, as with the Florodora Girl, there are musical numbers that were in the original version that are missing from this. And the maid's pep talk song, that's an artifact of try to make anything into a musical from 1930 only.
Right. Yeah, it was an interesting moment.
It's very odd, this moment of late 20s, early 30s Hollywood filmmaking. Because we've seen it in quite a few of our different series recently. In the Diana Wynyard series, in our last Studios episode, which was Paramount, in the Love Parade. This side of the pre-code, where marital infidelity can be discussed as a real possibility.
Well, it's an actuality in this movie. He's definitely sleeping with Lillian Roth.
Yeah, and, when divorce being discussed as a possibility in The Marriage Symphony, in the Diana Wynyard movie. But, coming from a completely different angle in The Love Parade, these movies that are very despondent about the ability of marriage to accommodate, let's say, the full personalities of the partners, and particularly the woman's, and to incorporate erotic excitement. And these movies become very, very bitter.
Yeah, this is a world that is basically crying out for the remedy, which is screwball comedy and the comedy of remarriage. This is what Hollywood hits upon, and we see the pathology of it in these late 20s, early 30s movies, and we see the physicians begin to heal themselves with the advent of It Happened One Night and all of the successor films that make being a couple seem fun again, or maybe for the first time.
How is that the answer? It's the answer because it says, and this is very Cavelian, how do we portray a modern relationship, a modern monogamous committed relationship of gender equality without offending anybody, without offending, either sex, particularly the male sex? How do we make that something that people believe in and want to invest in?
Yeah, so I guess DeMille was doing something fairly profound by showing us everything that was going wrong between the genders in America at this time.
How do we remake marriage in a truly modern image?
It's a nice thought to end on. Last week we mentioned that we were in a very difficult place as a household because our friend Dorothea, our cat, was in the veterinary hospital. Happy to report, after more than 2 days under terrible conditions, not the hospital's fault, but just the way things go. She was all by herself in this cage getting an intravenous treatment. She's back. She seems much like her old self, very happy. But that did mean that I had to miss a whole bunch of Marco Bellocchio films at the TIFF retrospective because I've been giving her pills several times a day. Elise, you did see a few. We're not really going to do Fear and Movie Going in Toronto because I can't talk about anything you've been seeing, but anything you want to highlight out of the movies you saw without me?
I did see the 5-hour series of the Aldo Mora kidnapping incident, Exterior Night.
So this is basically looking at what was going on in the world outside of the house where Mora was being held, for the most part.
I thought it was worth watching. They've all been worth watching, but a lot of his movies are going way over my head in terms of their strong and intricate relationship with Italian modern history and society. I did end up sitting next to a woman who had grown up in Italy and who remembered being around 8 when this incident occurred and remembered the huge impact it had on the society. And she was absolutely gripped by the series. To me, the most interesting sequence was still the single sequence dealing with the Red Brigades. To me, realizing that I don't know how to talk about authorial intention here, even less than usual, because of the reasons I just stated, but to me they came off as less naive and clownish than they did in Good Morning Night. There was more dialogic discussion between the various members that we saw, particularly the couple, the kidnapper couple, who are the main characters of the sequence, that made it feel to me, without losing the satirical aspect, the satirical gaze at these characters, I felt like I understood better why they felt backed into a corner, why they felt like, even though what they were doing was politically hopeless, nevertheless, they were at an impasse and felt like they couldn't do otherwise.
It's something I definitely want to see at some point. There may never be another chance to see it on the big screen, but I'll watch it some way.
Andrea Picard, Dave, did say that she would love to, we have not done all of the Bellocchios, and he is not done making movies. He's in production right now, so she would love to come back with even more Bellocchios.
Sounds good. Next time on the podcast, it's our Valentine special for 2025, My Conceptual Valentine. we'll be watching Her. This is the Spike Jonze film. And I'm thinking of ending things.
And these movies are not that easy to see right now. You have been able to find streaming services where we can watch them, though?
Yeah, we're going to have to get Netflix, I think, for one of them. But we'll do it. I'm looking forward to this one.
Oh, me too.
See you soon.